Some land remembers what men try to forget. The first frost of November clung to the fields like a thin sheet of glass as Daniel Mercer stood at the edge of his lower pasture, staring at the towering termite mound that had risen over the past decade like a monument no one had ordered. It stood nearly 6 feet tall, hard as kiln-fired clay, wide enough at the base that he couldn't wrap both arms around it if he tried. The wheat around it had grown thin and uneven, as if the soil itself had decided to step back. Daniel adjusted the brim of his faded work cap and rested both hands on the wooden handle of his shovel. At 40 years old, broad-shouldered and steady, with wind-creased skin and storm-gray eyes, he had learned to read terrain the way other men read newspapers. The land spoke in subtle ways, through dips in moisture, through the tilt of grass, through the silence of birds. And this patch had been quiet for too long. Beside him, Ranger, his 6-year-old German shepherd, stood unusually still. The dog's silver and tan coat caught the early light, his breath rising in soft clouds. Ranger was trained once to detect shifts beneath rubble and faint vibrations under concrete, skills Daniel rarely thought about anymore. But this morning the dog's ears were high, angled toward the mound, as if it were humming a note only he could hear. Daniel exhaled slowly. Just termites, he muttered, more to himself than to the dog. The farm outside Mill Creek had been a gamble, bought for less than it was worth because folks said the previous owners had left in a hurry back in the early 60s. Some said they moved west. Others said they simply disappeared into debt. Daniel had never asked too many questions. He wasn't looking for history. He was looking for quiet. He drove the shovel into the side of the mound. The blade struck hard-packed earth and bounced slightly, sending a dull vibration up his arms. Ranger didn't bark. He stepped closer instead, nose low, tail stiff, listening. Daniel drove the shovel in again, this time with more force. A chunk broke loose and tumbled down, revealing darker soil beneath, damp despite the dry spell. The air carried a faint metallic tang, subtle but sharp enough to make Daniel pause. He straightened, scanning the field. The wind moved through the remaining corn stalks with a low whisper, bending them in slow waves. Ranger circled once, then stopped at the base of the mound and pressed his paw against it, holding it there as if testing for a pulse. Daniel felt it then, not a tremor exactly, but a density in the ground that didn't belong. He had stood over enough disturbed soil in his lifetime to recognize when earth had been moved and asked to keep a secret. He drove the shovel deeper, angling it down. This time the blade struck something that rang back. A hollow, unmistakable sound. Not stone, not root. Metal. The vibration lingered for a half-second longer than it should have. Ranger stepped back and let out 3 short, controlled barks, the same pattern he used when signaling a structural void during training exercises years ago. Daniel froze. The morning felt suddenly narrower, the sky lower. He knelt and brushed away loose dirt with his gloved hand, revealing the faint curve of rusted steel beneath layers of packed soil and termite clay. The mound hadn't just grown over something. It had protected it, and whatever lay beneath had been waiting there, untouched, for 60 years. Daniel did not move for several seconds after the metal sound faded into the cold air. He stayed kneeling in the dirt, palm resting against the curved surface beneath the soil, as if confirming it was real and not a memory playing tricks on him. Ranger stepped closer again, lowering his head until his nose hovered inches above the exposed steel. The dog inhaled slowly, then exhaled through his nose in a quiet burst, ears still rigid and alert. The field around them had fallen into an almost unnatural stillness. Even the distant hum of traffic from the county road a mile away seemed to thin out, swallowed by the open sky. Daniel brushed away more soil with careful strokes, revealing a circular edge about 3 feet in diameter. It was not scrap metal tossed aside. It was deliberate. A lid. The surface was coated in rust and compacted clay, but the symmetry was unmistakable. Someone had placed this here with intention, and the termites had built over it year after year, as if sealing it from the world. He leaned back on his heels and scanned the horizon of his farm. 200 acres of winter wheat and dormant. Pasture stretched under the pale sun, broken only by the red barn near the tree line and the narrow gravel driveway leading to the house. Nothing about the landscape suggested secrets. That had been the comfort of it. He had chosen this place because it felt honest. He removed his gloves and pressed his bare hand flat against the metal. It was cold, colder than the air, as though it held on to a deeper chill from underground. Ranger suddenly shifted his stance and walked several paces to the east side of the mound, where he began pawing lightly at the dirt. Not frantically, methodically. 3 short scrapes. Then he stopped and looked back at Daniel. That look was familiar. It was the same look Ranger had given during training exercises when there was more than one void beneath a structure. Daniel stood slowly and retrieved a pry bar from the back of his pickup truck parked near the fence. The truck door closed with a hollow thud that echoed farther than usual across the open land. When he returned, he knelt again and wedged the flat end of the bar beneath the rim of the lid. The first attempt did not move it. The second produced a faint grinding sound, metal against compacted earth. On the third push, the seal broke with a muted sigh, as if the ground itself had exhaled after decades of holding its breath. Daniel froze, listening. No rush of air, no collapse, no sudden shift, just silence. He lifted the lid carefully, muscles tightening under his flannel shirt, and tilted it aside. Beneath it lay a narrow shaft reinforced with aged timber and lined with old brick, descending into darkness. A ladder made of iron rungs was bolted to one side, still intact despite the years. The air rising from below carried a dry, mineral scent, untouched by rot. It did not smell abandoned. It smelled preserved. Ranger approached the opening, but did not jump in or bark. Instead, he sat beside it, posture straight, gaze fixed downward as if keeping watch. Daniel felt a slow, steady beat in his chest, not fear exactly, but recognition. He had seen entrances like this before, built to hide things that mattered. He stood and walked back to the truck again, retrieving a heavy-duty flashlight and a length of rope. The sunlight had climbed higher now, burning off the frost and warming the edges of the field, but the circle of earth around the opening remained cool and shadowed. He secured the rope to the hitch of his truck out of habit more than necessity, then clipped the other end to his belt. Ranger watched every movement without blinking. Daniel stepped to the edge and shined the flashlight downward. The beam cut through the dark, revealing wooden shelves carved into the brick walls about 10 feet below. Dust motes floated lazily in the narrow column of light, undisturbed by wind for decades. On one of the shelves, something rectangular sat wrapped in oilcloth, edges squared and deliberate. This was not a forgotten well. It was a chamber built to keep memory intact. Daniel swallowed slowly, feeling the weight of the farm shift in his mind. The land he thought he owned had been guarding something long before his name appeared on any deed. Ranger let out a low, steady breath and leaned closer to the edge, eyes reflecting the thin white beam. Whatever waited below had not been lost. It had been waiting. Daniel stood at the edge of the opening for a long moment before committing to the descent. The rope at his belt felt unnecessary, yet he kept it secured, a quiet acknowledgement that caution was not fear but respect. Ranger remained seated beside the shaft, body aligned with the opening as if guarding it from both sides of time. Daniel lowered himself carefully onto the first iron rung. The metal was cold but steady, and when his boots found the second and third steps, the sound echoed upward in a muted rhythm that seemed older than the farm itself. 10 feet down, his boots met packed earth reinforced with flat stone. The air was cooler here, dry and faintly scented with aged paper and mineral dust. He raised the flashlight slowly, revealing shelves carved into the brick walls with a precision that did not belong to improvisation. This chamber had been measured, planned, built by hands that expected it to endure. The oilcloth-wrapped object rested on the middle shelf, edges sharp beneath the fabric. Daniel approached it without rushing, every movement deliberate. In his years overseas, he had learned that spaces built underground always carried intention. Some were meant to protect, others were meant to conceal. He reached out and touched the oilcloth. It crackled, softly under his fingers, brittle but intact. No moisture damage, no decay. He untied the thin cotton cord that bound it closed and folded the cloth back carefully. Inside lay a rectangular wooden box, about 18 inches long and perhaps 8 inches wide, its surface polished once, but now dulled by time. A small brass plate was affixed to the top. The engraving had faded, but under the beam of his flashlight, he could make out a name. Thomas Whitaker. Beneath it, a year. 1963, Daniel felt the subtle shift in his breathing. The previous owners of the farm had been Whitakers. He had seen the name once in county records, but had never given it weight. Ranger's nails clicked faintly above as the dog shifted position at the rim, still silent, still attentive. Daniel lifted the wooden lid. It opened without resistance. Inside were neatly stacked documents wrapped in wax paper, a leather-bound journal, and a small tin box no larger than a lunch pail. He set the journal aside first. The leather was cracked but supple, the pages yellowed yet preserved. He opened to the first entry. The handwriting was steady and deliberate, ink slightly faded but legible. It spoke of land disputes, of pressure from unnamed buyers seeking mineral rights beneath the fields. It mentioned surveys done without consent and visits from men who arrived in polished cars and left without shaking hands. Daniel turned another page. The entries grew more urgent, but never frantic. The writer believed something valuable lay beneath the property, something not yet publicly acknowledged. There were sketches of the lower pasture, precise measurements marking the very area where the termite mound had grown. The mound had not chosen that spot by accident. It had formed over disturbed earth. Sealing the entrance nature had been given to guard. Daniel closed the journal briefly and opened the tin box. Inside were folded deeds and a sealed envelope addressed simply, "To whoever finds this." He held the envelope in his hands for several seconds, feeling the faint texture of the paper. Above him, Ranger let out a single low breath, not a warning, but a reminder. Daniel broke the seal carefully. The letter inside was brief. It explained that Thomas Whitaker had refused to sell the land after discovering evidence of unauthorized drilling beneath neighboring farms. He had documented everything and hidden the proof in this chamber, fearing it would be destroyed if left in the house. The final lines were not angry. They were hopeful. If you are reading this, it means the land endured. Protect it. Daniel lowered the paper slowly. The farm above him was no longer just acreage and fencing. It was testimony. He turned the flashlight toward the far wall and noticed something he had not seen before. A second narrow passage extended beyond the shelves, partially bricked, but not fully sealed. Ranger shifted again above, and this time he gave 3 soft, measured barks, the same controlled signal he used when indicating there was more beyond the first find. Daniel felt the quiet gravity of that sound settle into his chest. Whatever Thomas Whitaker had hidden here was only the beginning. Daniel stood in the narrow chamber with the letter still open in his hand, the words protected echoing more heavily than any command he had ever followed. The flashlight beam trembled slightly as he shifted his grip, not from fear, but from the weight of realization. Above him, Ranger's silhouette moved across the rim of the opening, a steady shadow against the pale daylight filtering down. The second passage in the far wall was partially bricked, the mortar aged but not crumbling, as though whoever sealed it had not been rushed. Daniel stepped closer, boots scraping softly over packed earth. The passage was no more than 3 feet wide, and perhaps 5 feet high, forcing him to lower his shoulders slightly as he leaned in to examine it. The bricks blocking the entrance were set differently than the surrounding structure, newer by a shade, their edges sharper despite the decades. Someone had sealed this portion after the chamber was completed. He traced the mortar line with his fingertips and felt a faint draft, cool and deliberate, slipping through hairline cracks. Air meant space beyond. Ranger let out another low breath above, then the faint sound of claws shifting against soil. Daniel looked upward and spoke calmly, reassuring the dog more by tone than by words. He set the flashlight down on a shelf, angling it toward the passage, and pressed his shoulder against the first brick. It did not move. He stepped back and retrieved the pry bar he had carried down with him, wedging the flat edge carefully between 2 bricks near the top corner. The first push yielded only a small flake of mortar dust that drifted down like gray snow. The second push created a subtle shift, a faint crack tracing the line between brick and mortar. Daniel worked slowly, mindful that this chamber had survived 60 years because it had not been forced. After several minutes of patient leverage, 1 brick loosened enough to pull free. He set it aside gently. A narrow gap opened, revealing darkness beyond. He widened the opening brick by brick, stacking them neatly along the wall. The air that drifted through was cooler and carried a faint metallic scent mixed with something older, like stored machinery. When the gap was large enough, he leaned forward and shined the flashlight into the newly revealed space. The beam cut through dust and revealed a low tunnel extending another 8 or 10 feet before widening again. At the far end sat something large and angular beneath a canvas tarp that had stiffened with age. Daniel's pulse steadied into focus. He widened the entrance further until he could step through without scraping his shoulders. The tunnel floor was reinforced with wooden planks still surprisingly intact. Each step echoed softly, contained within the earth like a secret unwilling to travel. When he reached the tarp, he paused. Ranger above gave 3 soft barks again, evenly spaced, the signal that had always meant confirmation. Daniel reached out and grasped the edge of the canvas. The fabric resisted at first, then lifted with a dry rasp. Beneath it stood a compact drilling apparatus, rusted at the joints but unmistakable in shape. Pipes coiled beside it, tagged with faded markings. A clipboard hung from a nail on the adjacent wall, protected by a sheet of waxed paper. Daniel removed it carefully. The documents beneath were technical diagrams and soil reports stamped with a corporate name he recognized from regional headlines about energy expansion decades ago. The dates aligned with the final entries in Thomas Whitaker's journal. The unauthorized drilling had not been rumor. It had been prepared and likely interrupted. Daniel stood in the confined space, absorbing the quiet evidence of what had been hidden. This was not a treasure chest of gold or forgotten heirlooms. It was proof. Proof that someone had tried to reach beneath the land without consent, and proof that another man had chosen to resist quietly but decisively. Above, Ranger's posture shifted from alert to steady, as if sensing the moment had settled into understanding. Daniel lowered the tarp again gently, not out of concealment, but out of respect. The farm above was no longer just a refuge from his past. It was a responsibility that had waited through seasons and silence for someone willing to listen. Daniel remained in the narrow tunnel for several more minutes, allowing his eyes to adjust beyond the reach of the flashlight beam. The drilling apparatus stood like a frozen intention, halted mid-purpose and preserved by secrecy rather than decay. He ran his hand lightly over one of the pipes, feeling the roughness of oxidation beneath his fingers. It had not been used long. The wear was minimal. Whatever operation had been planned here had been stopped early, perhaps abruptly, yet not chaotically. The documents on the clipboard confirmed that soil samples had revealed mineral deposits deep beneath the lower pasture, likely valuable enough to draw corporate interest, but unstable enough to risk contaminating the groundwater that fed Mill Creek. Daniel folded the diagrams carefully and slid them into his jacket. The air in the chamber felt heavier now, not suffocating but purposeful, as though the earth itself had been waiting for acknowledgement. Above, Ranger shifted again, then lowered himself fully onto the soil beside the opening, posture calm but unwavering. Daniel extinguished the flashlight for a moment and stood in darkness, listening. There was no machinery hum, no distant traffic, no echo of movement. Only the subtle sound of air traveling through narrow brick seams. He had spent years listening for danger in silence. This silence felt different. It felt patient. He relit the flashlight and retraced his steps through the tunnel, ducking slightly as he passed back through the partially opened brick threshold. In the main chamber, the wooden shelves seemed less mysterious now and more resolute. Thomas Whitaker had not hidden fear. He had hidden truth. Daniel climbed the iron rungs slowly, emerging into the pale afternoon light. The sun had shifted westward, casting long stripes across the field. Ranger immediately stood and pressed his shoulder gently against Daniel's leg, not anxious, simply present. Daniel placed the wooden lid loosely back over the shaft without sealing it fully, marking the spot in his mind rather than erasing it again. The termite mound lay broken beside the opening, its hardened walls scattered in. Fragments that resembled pieces of an old monument dismantled by time. He walked a slow circle around the disturbed earth, noticing how the soil here was darker and richer than the surrounding field. Decades of concealment had protected more than documents. It had preserved the land itself from deeper intrusion. Daniel removed his cap and wiped a thin line of dust from his forehead. The farm no longer felt like a quiet escape purchased at a discount. It felt like a trust handed forward. In the distance, the red barn stood steady against the horizon, and beyond it the creek line shimmered faintly in the afternoon sun. He imagined the water running beneath the pasture, clean and steady because someone had chosen restraint over profit. Ranger trotted toward the creek side of the field and paused, glancing back as if suggesting perspective. Daniel followed at an easy pace, boots pressing into soil that now seemed layered with unseen history. At the edge of the pasture, he stopped and looked back at the broken mound and the small opening in the earth. The scene was ordinary from a distance, almost unremarkable. Yet beneath it rested evidence that could shift ownership disputes, corporate narratives, and perhaps even restore a name nearly erased from county memory. He knelt and let his fingers sift through the soil once more, feeling its cool texture run through his hand. 60 years had passed in quiet rotation of seasons, and the land had endured without speaking. Ranger sat beside him, gaze fixed not on the hole but on the horizon, as if already aware that the discovery was not about what was buried but about what would be done next. Daniel understood that uncovering truth was only the first step. Protecting it would require steadiness, patience, and a willingness to stand firm without raising his voice. The wind moved gently across the pasture, bending the remaining stalks in a soft wave. For the first time since he purchased the farm, Daniel did not feel like a man hiding from his past. He felt like a man entrusted with something larger than himself, something that had waited beneath his feet until the day a loyal dog listened closely enough to hear the earth breathe. The sun dipped lower as Daniel and Ranger walked back toward the farmhouse, the broken mound now just a shadowed rise in the rear. Pasture. The air carried that late afternoon stillness that settles over open land in early November, when the light turns thin and gold, and every fence post throws a longer memory than it did at noon. Daniel did not rush. He let his boots move at a steady pace, the gravel crunching beneath each step like a quiet metronome. Ranger stayed close to his left side, occasionally glancing back toward the field as if measuring distance not in yards but in consequence. Inside the house, the warmth felt different than it had that morning. The kitchen smelled faintly of black coffee and cedar smoke from the wood stove. Daniel set the folded diagrams and the letter from Thomas Whitaker on the old oak table near the window. The late sun washed over the papers, illuminating the faded ink and the careful lines of the soil charts. He sat down slowly, elbows resting on the table, and read through the journal entries again, this time not as a discovery, but as a responsibility. The handwriting carried no bitterness, only conviction. Whitaker had written about meetings with county officials, about quiet refusals to sign documents that would have transferred mineral rights beneath the pasture. He had described the pressure in measured language, never dramatic, simply persistent. Daniel could recognize that tone. It was the voice of someone who chose to stand without shouting. Ranger lay down near the doorway, head resting on his paws, but eyes open, watching Daniel with steady awareness. Outside, the wind brushed along the siding, soft and even, as if the house itself had been waiting for this moment to exhale. Daniel reached for his phone, then paused. Instinct told him to call someone immediately, to report what he had found, to bring light into the hidden chamber before darkness could return to it. But another instinct, older and steadier, urged patience. Whitaker had not hidden the evidence to be rushed into chaos. He had preserved it for clarity. Daniel folded the letter carefully and placed it back into the envelope. He walked to the small desk in the corner of the living room and retrieved the original deed to his property. The language was straightforward, transferring surface rights and full agricultural use. But the mineral rights section carried amendments from decades past, small footnotes referencing corporate leases that had expired under unclear conditions. Daniel felt a quiet alignment forming between past and present. Ranger stood and walked over, pressing his shoulder lightly against Daniel's leg again, the silent reassurance that had accompanied him through more uncertain terrain than this. Daniel stepped onto the back porch and looked out toward the creek line. The water caught the last light of day, reflecting it in thin ribbons. If unauthorized drilling had begun here 60 years ago, it could have altered everything downstream. The thought did not ignite anger in him. It awakened steadiness. He understood now why the termite mound had grown exactly where it did. Nature had layered protection over a decision that needed witness. As dusk settled, Daniel walked back toward the pasture one more time, carrying a wooden stake and a coil of bright orange survey tape. He marked the perimeter around the opening carefully, not as a warning, but as a declaration that the space would not be forgotten again. Ranger circled once around the marked area, then sat facing west as the sky deepened into amber and violet. Daniel stood beside him in silence. The farm no longer felt like borrowed ground. It felt like entrusted soil, layered with choices made long before he arrived. He realized that uncovering truth was only the beginning of a longer path. Tomorrow he would contact an environmental attorney in town, someone he trusted to read through mineral contracts and historical filings without distortion. Tonight, however, he allowed the land to settle around him. The wind eased. The field quieted. And beneath his boots, the earth that had guarded its secret for 60 years felt steady, as if relieved that someone had finally listened closely enough to hear it speak. Morning arrived with a pale gray sky stretched thin over the pasture, the kind of sky that felt undecided between rain and clarity. Daniel rose before sunrise, not from habit alone, but from the steady awareness that the land beneath him carried unfinished conversation. Ranger was already awake, seated near the back door, ears angled toward the field as if he had listened through the night. When Daniel stepped onto the porch, the air carried the clean scent of damp soil and distant water from Mill Creek. The orange survey tape he had tied around the marked perimeter moved gently in the breeze, a quiet signal against the muted tones of winter grass. He walked toward the lower pasture with a thermos of coffee in one hand and the journal tucked securely inside his jacket. Ranger trotted slightly ahead, posture alert but calm, occasionally lowering his nose to the ground, as if confirming that nothing had shifted in the night. The opening in the earth remained as he had left it, lid resting loosely in place. The broken fragments of the termite mound scattered nearby, like an old shell no longer needed. Daniel removed the lid again and let the cool air rise from below. In daylight, the chamber seemed less ominous and more deliberate, a crafted space rather than a buried accident. He descended carefully, boots finding each rung with quiet certainty. The chamber greeted him with the same stillness, shelves intact, dust undisturbed. He walked to the secondary tunnel and studied the drilling apparatus again, this time with a steadier mind. He noticed details he had missed before, serial numbers etched into metal casings, a corporate insignia stamped faintly along the base, and a small canvas tool roll tucked behind the machinery. He opened the roll and found precision instruments used for soil sampling, each wrapped in cloth and preserved as though waiting to be reclaimed. Daniel lifted one instrument and felt its weight, imagining the hands that once held it with intention. The journal entries described the moment Whitaker realized that the drilling was not exploratory but extractive, that the land would be pierced not for knowledge but for profit. He had documented dates, license numbers, and even the names of survey contractors. Daniel understood now why the operation had been halted quietly rather than publicly. If exposed recklessly, the evidence could have been dismissed or buried under legal complexity. By sealing it beneath his own field, Whitaker ensured that the land itself would testify when the time was right. Ranger's faint movement above signaled awareness rather than alarm. Daniel climbed back up and stood at the edge of the pasture, looking toward the tree line where the creek curved behind a stand of sycamores. He imagined what drilling might have meant for that water, for the farms downstream, for the small town that relied on wells fed by the same aquifer. The responsibility felt heavier than property lines. It felt communal. He walked toward the barn and retrieved a weatherproof storage case from the tool bench, returning to the chamber to carefully transfer the documents and instruments into safer containment. He did not intend to remove everything yet, only enough to begin formal verification. Ranger remained stationed near the opening, head high, as though guarding both past and future. When Daniel sealed the case and climbed out for the final time that morning, the clouds had begun to thin, allowing narrow shafts of sunlight to break through. The light touched the survey tape, the broken mound, and the steady earth beneath. Daniel placed his hand against Ranger's neck, feeling the warmth of his fur against the cool air. 60 years had passed before the land spoke clearly again. It had chosen not noise, not spectacle, but patience. And now, standing in the quiet of his own pasture, Daniel understood that some truths are not uncovered to be displayed. They are uncovered to be protected, so that what flows beneath the surface may continue clean and undisturbed long after those who guarded it are gone. By mid-afternoon, the clouds had cleared completely, leaving a wide blue sky stretched over the pasture as if nothing extraordinary had ever rested beneath it. Daniel had driven into town earlier that day, the weatherproof case secured on the passenger seat while Ranger sat upright beside it, watchful and steady. The attorney he trusted, Margaret Ellis, had received him without surprise, only with the calm attention of someone accustomed to reading between lines others overlooked. She had examined the dated soil reports, the diagrams, and the journal entries with measured silence, her brow tightening slightly at the corporate insignia stamped across the drilling equipment serial numbers Daniel had photographed. She confirmed what he already sensed. The leases referenced in the deed amendments had expired under contested circumstances, and any unauthorized extraction beneath his land would have been unlawful even at the time. She advised careful documentation, formal environmental review, and immediate filing to the post-sinking firm and straight. The act felt less like a warning and more like a promise. Ranger circled the area once before settling near the sign, posture relaxed but attentive, as if recognizing that something had shifted from secrecy to stewardship. The creek beyond the tree line shimmered under the afternoon sun, its surface moving in quiet patterns that had likely remained unchanged for generations. Daniel walked toward it slowly, boots brushing against dormant grass, and crouched at the bank. He dipped his fingers into the water and felt its cold clarity run over his skin. For 60 years this current had flowed untouched by the machinery hidden beneath the pasture. It had carried rainwater, snowmelt, and reflections of countless seasons without knowing how close it had come to alteration. He rose and looked back across the land. The barn stood steady, the farmhouse windows catching the light, the pasture stretching wide and unbroken. Ranger joined him at the creek, lowering his head to drink before lifting it again, droplets falling like small beads of glass. Daniel understood now that uncovering the chamber had not been an act of disruption. It had been an act of listening. The land had not demanded rescue. It had required witness. In the days ahead there would be paperwork, soil assessments, and perhaps public records brought into daylight. But in this moment, standing beside clear water and open sky, Daniel felt no urgency to broadcast the discovery. Truth did not weaken when handled quietly. It strengthened. Ranger leaned gently against his leg, grounding him in the present. The sun began its descent toward the western ridge, casting long amber lines across the pasture where the termite mound once stood intact. The broken fragments had already begun to blend into the soil again, as if returning to their purpose. Daniel took a slow breath, letting the cool air fill his lungs. Some inheritances arrive in envelopes or bank accounts. Others rise from the ground in silence, asking only for courage steady enough to protect them. And as the evening light settled over the farm, Daniel knew that the most valuable thing hidden beneath his land had not been machinery or documents. It had been a choice made decades ago to value water, soil, and community over profit. A choice that had waited patiently for someone willing to hear it. Ranger gazed out across the field, ears lifted toward the wind, and the earth beneath them felt quiet, not because it had nothing left to say, but because it finally had been heard. The next morning dawned clear and steady, the kind of morning that does not rush itself into being. A thin layer of mist hovered above the creek, lifting slowly as sunlight spilled over the ridge and into the pasture. Daniel stood on the back porch with a mug of black coffee warming his hands, watching the light reach across the lower field where the survey tape fluttered softly around the marked ground. Ranger sat beside him, posture upright, ears tuned not to alarm but to presence. The farm felt different now, not louder, not heavier, but awake in a way it had not been before. Word had not yet spread beyond Margaret Ellis and a single environmental consultant she recommended, a quiet man named Thomas Reed who arrived just after 9 in a dusty pickup with state inspection decals along the door. Reed carried equipment cases and a demeanor that matched the land itself, unhurried and attentive. Daniel led him to the marked perimeter without explanation beyond the documents already shared. Ranger walked ahead of them, nose low but movements calm, as though guiding rather than guarding. Reed examined the opening carefully, lowering a portable camera into the shaft and studying the live feed on a handheld monitor. He said little at first. He only nodded once when the secondary tunnel, and preserved drilling apparatus came into view. The soil samples taken near the opening were collected methodically, sealed, labeled, and placed into padded containers. Reed spoke finally in a low, thoughtful tone, confirming that no extraction appeared to have reached operational depth and that groundwater contamination risk remained minimal due to the halted installation. The land had indeed been spared. Daniel listened without interruption, absorbing the words as confirmation of something he already felt beneath his boots. After Reed departed with assurances of formal documentation within the week, Daniel remained by the pasture. Ranger lay down near the metal sign, chin resting on his paws, amber eyes tracking the movement of distant crows across the sky. Daniel descended once more into the chamber, not to retrieve, but to preserve. He secured protective coverings over the drilling apparatus and resealed the secondary passage with reinforced supports, ensuring stability without erasure. The wooden lid was replaced firmly but accessibly, not hidden again beneath earth, but shielded with respect. When he climbed back into daylight, the sun had climbed high, illuminating the entire field in clean brilliance. Daniel removed his cap and ran a hand through his hair, feeling a quiet steadiness settle into his chest. He realized that the greatest change had not occurred underground but within him. He had purchased this farm seeking distance from memories he did not wish to revisit. Yet the land had offered him something else entirely, a chance to stand guard not over conflict, but over preservation. Ranger rose and walked to his side, pressing gently against his leg as he had done so many times before. The bond between them required no command. It had been built on listening, on reading signals beneath noise. Daniel looked toward the creek again, the water moving clear and undisturbed beneath the afternoon light. 60 years earlier, another man had chosen to protect that flow rather than profit from what lay beneath it. Now the responsibility had shifted quietly forward, not through inheritance written in a will, but through discovery written in soil. The pasture stretched wide and calm, the broken termite mound already blending into the earth as if returning to anonymity. Daniel understood that some legacies are not monuments. They are decisions carried forward by those willing to hear them. Ranger lifted his ears toward the wind, tail still, posture calm. The land no longer held its breath. It felt settled, acknowledged. And as Daniel stood in the open field beneath a sky unmarred by smoke or shadow, he knew that what had been hidden for 60 years had not been waiting for fortune. It had been waiting for stewardship, for a steady hand, and a listening heart willing to protect what flows unseen beneath the surface. In the weeks that followed, the farm settled into a new rhythm, not louder but more deliberate, as though every fence line and furrow understood that something long guarded had finally been acknowledged. Official letters arrived in plain envelopes stamped with county seals and environmental agency insignias, each confirming what the soil samples and archived filings had already suggested. The mineral lease that once hovered uncertainly over the lower pasture was formally declared void under current review, and Daniel's rights to the land beneath his boots were reaffirmed in writing. He did not celebrate the documents. He placed them in a simple folder inside his desk, alongside Thomas Whitaker's journal and the carefully preserved letter. Ranger watched him one evening as he organized the papers, the dog's amber eyes reflecting the lamplight like quiet embers. Outside, early winter had begun to edge the pasture with silver-frosted dawn, the creek running clear beneath a thin rim of ice that formed and vanished with each sunrise. Daniel found himself walking the lower field more often, not to inspect but to listen. The orange survey tape had been replaced with a low wooden barrier that blended into the land, respectful rather than dramatic. He had chosen not to reseal the chamber permanently. Instead, he reinforced it properly, installed a secure hatch, and registered the site as a protected historical and environmental landmark under local statutes. The drilling apparatus remained below, documented but undisturbed, preserved as evidence of a decision that had favored water over wealth. One afternoon, a small group from the County Historical Society visited at Margaret Ellis's suggestion. They stood quietly at the edge of the pasture while Daniel explained the timeline without embellishment. He spoke of Whitaker not as a hero, but as a farmer who valued the creek that ran behind his barn. The visitors listened with the same measured attention the land itself seemed to command. Ranger remained seated near Daniel's side throughout the visit, posture calm. ears occasionally lifting toward distant sounds, but never breaking focus. When the group departed, leaving behind a promise to archive the findings respectfully, Daniel felt no sense of spectacle. There were no headlines, no cameras, no raised voices. Only acknowledgement. The farm continued its seasonal work. Fences were repaired, seed orders placed, equipment serviced in the barn under the steady hum of fluorescent lights. Yet beneath the routine, a subtle shift had taken root. Daniel no longer felt like a man who had purchased land as refuge. He felt like a steward standing in a longer line of guardianship. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the pasture in shades of amber and rose, he walked to the creek once more with Ranger at his side. The water moved steadily over smooth stones, reflecting the sky in fractured ribbons of light. He crouched at the bank and watched his reflection ripple with the current. Years earlier, he had searched for quiet because noise lingered too easily in his memory. Now he understood that true quiet was not the absence of sound, but the presence of purpose. Ranger stepped into the shallow edge of the creek, paused steady, and looked back at him with the same unwavering awareness that had guided him to the Termite Mound weeks before. Daniel smiled faintly and rose to his feet. The pasture behind him stretched wide and open, the barn standing firm against the horizon, the secured hatch blending seamlessly into the field as if it had always belonged. 60 years had passed before truth resurfaced in that soil, not with force, but with patience. And as twilight settled over the farm, Daniel felt the land exhale fully, no longer holding its breath beneath layers of clay and silence. Some discoveries change the shape of a life in an instant. Others unfold quietly, like water carving its path through stone. Standing beside clear water and steady earth, Daniel knew that what had been uncovered was not merely a hidden chamber or a halted machine. It was a reminder that integrity, once planted, can endure beneath any weight of time, waiting for someone willing to hear the ground speak and choose, once again, to protect what flows unseen beneath it. Winter moved in quietly across the farm, not with storms or sharp winds, but with a steady cooling of the air that settled into the soil and lingered beneath the surface. The pasture wore a thin coat of frost each morning, silvering the grass and outlining the wooden barrier that marked the protected site. Daniel rose early as he always did, the rhythm of chores unchanged, yet the weight behind each step carried a quiet awareness that the land beneath him had chosen him as much as he had chosen it. Ranger followed him from barn to fence line, his breath visible in the cold dawn, ears attentive to distant sounds that drifted across the fields. The secured hatch in the lower pasture remained undisturbed, blending so naturally into the terrain that only someone who knew its story would notice its significance. The county had completed its review, issuing formal recognition of the chamber as both a historical and environmental preservation point. There would be no excavation for profit, no late-night machinery breaking the horizon. Instead, there was documentation, recorded testimony, and a small plaque now fixed discreetly near the creek path acknowledging Thomas Whitaker's stewardship decades earlier. Daniel had insisted the wording remain simple. It read that the land was preserved through the integrity of its former owner and the vigilance of its current one. Nothing more. On a clear afternoon, Daniel carried the journal to the edge of the field and sat on an overturned feed bucket, reading again the steady handwriting that had once recorded quiet resistance. Ranger lay nearby, head resting across his paws, occasionally lifting his gaze toward the creek as if sensing movement beneath its reflective surface. Daniel realized that what Whitaker had done was not dramatic. He had not rallied crowds or sought attention. He had made a decision aligned with conscience and allowed time to guard it. That realization shifted something inside Daniel. For years after returning home from service, he had measured his worth against visible action, against outcomes that could be counted or recorded. The farm had offered him stillness, but beneath that stillness lay a deeper lesson. Integrity does not require applause. It requires endurance. The creek continued its steady course beyond the sycamores, ice forming and dissolving along its edges with each passing morning. Wildlife returned to the lower pasture without hesitation, deer tracks weaving near the barrier as if acknowledging that the ground was safe. Daniel found himself speaking softly sometimes when he walked alone, not in conversation with anyone visible, but in quiet reflection with the land itself. Ranger would glance back at him during those moments, tail moving once in recognition, as if understanding that listening extended beyond sound. One evening, as snow began to fall in slow, deliberate flakes, Daniel stood at the pasture's edge and watched the white blanket settle over the field. The barrier, the sign, the once towering termite mound, all softened beneath the snowfall until the ground appeared untouched once more. Yet he knew what rested beneath that quiet surface. He understood now that the true discovery had not been machinery or legal documentation. It had been continuity. A decision made in 1963 had traveled through seasons of rain and drought, through shifting ownership and passing decades, until it met a man and his dog willing to hear its echo. Ranger stepped closer as the snow gathered lightly along his back, amber eyes bright against the gray sky. Daniel placed his hand against the dog's neck, feeling warmth beneath fur despite the cold air. The farm stretched around them, hushed and steady, as if grateful to be left whole. And as winter deepened and the year drew toward its quiet close, Daniel understood that stewardship was not a single act. It was a posture, renewed each day beneath open sky, carried forward by those who listen closely enough to know when the earth speaks, and strong enough to protect what it asks to remain. By late winter the snow had settled into quiet drifts along the fence lines, softening the edges of the pasture and turning the lower field into a wide sheet of white beneath an open sky. Daniel walked the perimeter each morning, boots pressing steady tracks into the frost, Ranger pacing beside him with the same patient vigilance he had carried since the day the earth first revealed its hidden chamber. The wooden barrier around the protected site stood firm despite the cold, its simple structure now dusted with snow that caught the early light like scattered glass. The small plaque near the creek had begun to gather a thin rim of ice along its edges, yet the words remained visible, a quiet acknowledgement anchored into the soil. Daniel had not sought attention, but word traveled gently through the county. Neighbors began stopping by more often, not out of curiosity for machinery or legal documents, but out of respect for what the land represented. They spoke about wells and harvests, about water tables and seasons, about the importance of keeping what runs beneath their farms clear and undisturbed. Daniel listened more than he spoke. Ranger would sit at his side during these conversations, posture relaxed yet attentive, his presence grounding the moment in something steady and real. One afternoon, a local schoolteacher asked if a small group of students might visit in the spring to learn about environmental stewardship. Daniel considered the request carefully. He did not want the chamber to become spectacle, yet he understood that stories passed forward in quiet ways shape futures more gently than warnings shouted too late. He agreed on the condition that the visit focus not on hidden equipment, but on the idea that land carries memory and responsibility. As winter slowly yielded to early thaw, the creek began to swell with meltwater, its surface moving with renewed strength beneath the sycamores. Daniel often stood at its edge with Ranger, watching chunks of thin ice drift past like fragments of old seasons breaking free. He reflected on how close that water had once come to contamination, how easily profit could have altered the clarity now shimmering in the afternoon light. Yet it had not. A decision made decades earlier had endured long enough to meet another man willing to honor it. The chamber beneath the pasture remained sealed but accessible, documented in county archives and monitored through routine inspection. Daniel had invested in additional soil testing across neighboring sections of the farm, ensuring that no remnants of past intent lingered unseen. Each report returned clean, reinforcing what he felt intuitively beneath his boots. The land was whole. Ranger's instincts had not only uncovered history, they had protected continuity. As March approached, patches of green began pushing through the snow along the lower field, fragile yet determined. Daniel walked the pasture one evening as the sun dipped low, its amber light stretching long across the thawing earth. The remnants of the once towering mound had fully blended into the soil, indistinguishable from the rest of the field. Nature had reclaimed its shape without erasing its lesson. Ranger paused near the wooden barrier and looked back at Daniel, tail steady, ears lifted toward the wind that moved gently across the open acres. Daniel stepped closer and rested his hand against the cool wood, feeling the solid grain beneath his palm. He realized that stewardship is not defined by dramatic gestures. It is defined by daily presence, by the quiet refusal to look away when something beneath the surface asks to be protected. The sky above the farm deepened into soft blue, scattered with the first returning birds of the season. Their flight traced wide arcs overhead, untroubled and free. Daniel felt a calm certainty settle into his chest. The discovery that began with a shovel striking metal had unfolded into something far larger than evidence or preservation. It had become a reminder that integrity, once planted in soil, can outlast pressure, time, and silence. And as Ranger stood beside him beneath the open horizon, the land stretched wide and unbroken, carrying forward a legacy not of extraction, but of restraint, entrusted once more to steady hands willing to listen when the earth speaks. Spring arrived fully one quiet morning when Daniel stepped onto the porch and realized the air no longer carried the sharp edge of winter. The pasture below rolled in soft shades of green, new growth rising evenly across the field as if nothing had ever disturbed it. Wildflowers had begun to appear near the fence posts, small bursts of yellow and violet that leaned gently toward the sun. Ranger stood at the top of the steps, ears lifted toward the breeze, his posture relaxed yet attentive in the way it had become since the day the earth first answered his instinct. Daniel walked down toward the lower pasture, boots brushing through fresh grass that bent and then lifted again behind him. The wooden barrier surrounding the protected site remained steady and modest, weathered slightly by snow and thaw, but strong in its purpose. The plaque near the creek had settled into its place, no longer new, simply present. He paused at the edge of the field and listened. Birds moved through the sycamores, their calls layered softly over the steady current of Mill Creek. The water shimmered beneath the warming light, clear and unburdened. Daniel felt the quiet continuity of it all. Months had passed since the discovery, and life on the farm had returned to its seasonal rhythm. Seed had been planted, equipment repaired, fences mended. Yet beneath the routine lay a deeper steadiness, as though the land and the man who tended it had reached an understanding. Ranger trotted ahead and stopped near the place where the termite mound once stood towering and sealed. Nothing marked it now except healthy grass and even soil. Nature had folded the memory back into itself, not erasing it, but integrating it into the larger story of the field. Daniel knelt and pressed his palm against the earth. It felt warm from the sun, alive with quiet energy. He remembered the hollow ring of metal beneath his shovel, the moment instinct met history, and he allowed himself a faint smile. Some moments divide a life into before and after. Others weave quietly into it, changing direction without noise. The students from the local school had visited weeks earlier, standing respectfully near the barrier as Daniel spoke about stewardship rather than secrets. He had told them that land does not belong to one person alone. It passes through hands, and each generation leaves it better or worse than they found it. Ranger had remained seated. During that visit, steady and watchful, as if aware that the lesson was not only spoken but lived. Now, standing alone in the bright spring light, Daniel understood that the true inheritance of this farm had never been written into a contract. It had been carried forward through choice. Thomas Whitaker had chosen to protect what flowed unseen beneath the soil. Daniel had chosen to listen when the ground answered back. And Ranger, guided by instinct and loyalty, had bridged the space between past and present with 3 steady barks that changed everything. The horizon stretched wide, uninterrupted by machinery or smoke, only open sky and moving clouds casting slow shadows across the pasture. Daniel rose and looked out over the acres that now felt less like refuge and more like responsibility embraced. He felt no weight pressing on his shoulders, only a grounded certainty that he was exactly where he was meant to stand. Ranger returned to his side, leaning gently against his leg, amber eyes reflecting the clear afternoon light. The creek continued its steady course beyond the trees, carrying water that would feed wells, nourish crops, and sustain life long after both men were gone. Daniel took a slow breath and let it settle deep within him. The land beneath his boots was quiet again, not because it had nothing left to say, but because it no longer needed to whisper for protection. It had been heard. And in that wide, open stillness, With spring unfolding across the pasture and a loyal dog at his side, Daniel understood that sometimes the greatest treasures are not those extracted from the earth, but those preserved within it, waiting patiently for someone willing to listen and choose, once more, to protect what cannot speak for itself.